Welcome to the Software Security Gurus webcast. I'm your host, Matias Madou, CTO and co-founder of Secure Code Warrior. This webcast is co-sponsored by Secure Code Warrior. For more information, visit www.softwaresecuritygurus.com. This is the 7th in a series of interviews with security gurus, and I'm super pleased to have with me today Clint Gibler. Welcome, Clint.
Hey, Matias. Glad to be here.
Thanks. Hey, Clint, do you mind actually sharing a few words about yourself?
Sure. My name is Clint Gibler. I am the head of security research for a small startup called R2C. We're building sort of a next generation lightweight static analysis that's fast, easy to customize, and a pleasure to use. Before that, I was a research director and technical director at NCC Group, a global consulting firm. And before that, I was a grad student at UC Davis. I've done a little bit of a lot of stuff.
And actually, I think you forgot a very important one. You also did an internship back in the day at Fortify, right around the time when we actually got acquired by HP. And I was there too. So that was a lot of fun, right?
Yeah, that was a ton of fun. A number of my friends and sort of mentors to this day actually all come from that brief period. Like Flea, Jonathan Carter, I chatted with Jacob West recently. Yeah, I think for such a short amount of time, it's one of the densest, most useful, awesome professional experiences I ever had, and very fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a really good crowd that we have. So I'm not surprised that you're still in touch with a lot of people from back in the day, because they're everywhere in the Bay Area, right?
Yeah, the Fortify Mafia, I think people call it.
Yes. So you worked on static analysis, and it's quite funny because if I look at what you're producing lately, I think you have some sort of a hate-love relationship with static analysis, because on the one hand you're all about automation, but at the same time I hear you say hey, well, people do not get the most value out of static analysis solutions. Can you dive a little bit deeper on this contradictory?
Yeah, love-hate is a good way to describe it. So I did a number of projects related to static analysis in grad school, and then at Fortify, I did obviously some as well. And it was interesting to see sort of the theory, this seems like a very promising approach to sort of leveling up security at scale, because you don't need to manually look through all the code. And then at NCC Group, I was brought into so many companies who were like, hey, we're paying a lot of money for this expensive tool, but we're not getting a lot of value from it because it's just drowning us in false positives. So I think there's been sort of a shift in how companies approach security, at least I've seen in the Bay Area, where they're sort of de-emphasizing this focus on identifying vulnerabilities and instead focusing more on secure defaults and sort of proving the absence of the vulnerability. So it's sort of like the same problem, but looked at the other way. So rather than can you find all the bugs, can you just set up an environment, an ecosystem, and have strong secure defaults that make a vulnerability impossible, so you don't have to find them.
And actually, so I think, you analyzed, if I'm not mistaken, you analyzed 50 conference talks in the last 2 years, something like that. It was a crazy amount, right? And dozens of blog posts, which you all summarized and put into one slide deck. And then over there, if I may say, well, you're fortunate to look into presentations that talk the latest and greatest about secure defaults. So do you mind elaborating a little bit what that means, and can you give a good example of a secure default that everybody should do?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to give you a little bit of a background, I gave a couple of talks at AppSec Cali and RSA and Besides SF that were basically a conglomeration of probably 50 to 75 talks, dozens of blog posts and tools, and even more conversations I had with security professionals at many companies, just sort of over drinks or at meetups in the city. And I sort of started on this path by accident, to be honest. I didn't intend to do it. I just started. I was having drinks with a friend, and he was like, "Hey, here's some cool interesting, novel stuff that we're doing at my company that we haven't really talked about publicly. And there was some stuff that I'd never heard of. And I was like, oh, man, that's awesome. And then maybe a couple of days later, I was hanging out with a different friend at a different company, and they said something different from what the first person said, like a lot of overlap, but some difference. And I just sort of kept going to different friends of mine and being like, hey, like, what's your coolest tips and hacks? And I sort of collected all of these insights into one talk. But I didn't intend to do it. I just like chatted with a bunch of people, and I'm like, oh, people should know about this.
Yeah, no, it's a very clever idea, because if you go through your presentation, you actually get a synopsis of what happened in the last 2 years in application security. So I actually highly recommend it to watch it, because there's a ton of useful information in there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we can share a link to it perhaps below.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, the goal is like, there's so much material out there, you don't have much time to absorb. Like, most people aren't willing to spend hundreds of hours absorbing various things because they have a life or friends or something more meaningful. But I was like, oh, let's just save people time. But to get to your question, like, what's a secure default? I think one of the most impactful things I've seen at a couple of companies is they really they choose like a vulnerability class and then they try to eradicate it. And there's some compounding wins that happen when you do that, because you no longer have to spend time, educating developers about it, or triaging bug bounty or pen test, or making sure that the fixes don't regress. Like, there's like 5 to 7 like types of activity for that vulnerability class you just like don't have to do anymore, because you're like, okay, like we've solved that. Cool. So I think that's one insight that's interesting. Like, once you sort of, rather than stomp out a few, say, cross-site scripting, if you just categorically eliminate it, there's compounding effects there, because then you can focus that time on the next vulnerability class and then becoming more and more highly leveraged as a security team. So I think that insight is important. But an example is, say, for example, you have had a number of XXE issues in the past. So parsing XML, you allow sort of external DTTs to be referenced. But let's say you're like, okay, I'm an AppSec engineer. I want to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. Mm-hmm. So what you can do is create like a secure wrapper library where basically it configures the parser such that none of the bad things can happen.
Yep.
And then you say, hey, developers, I built this thing for you. Please use this. Then you check for all the places in the code where someone is not doing that. Yeah. Then ideally you have sort of lightweight checks in CI/CD itself to make sure that new places where that's doing the wrong thing like are not introduced again. And then basically you don't have to worry about that issue anymore. So it's basically like, oh yeah, keep going.
No. So I actually agree with everything that you said, except for I'm sometimes questioning how practical that is, because quite often. I think it highly depends on the organization and company, because there's people with tons and tons of legacy where this is very good from a theoretical perspective, but from a practical perspective, they're like, well, but our code runs, so we'll leave it like that. And in, I think, newer type of companies, you can do something, like secure defaults, which is the recommended way. But I'm not sure how practical that is. And from your experience, is that, how often can you do that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think especially big, monstrous, complex legacy systems that perform very impactful, like high throughput work that, like, if it goes down, you're losing like millions of dollars an hour or a day. Yeah, I think so. One way to do that is if you can make the secure wrapper version basically like a API one-to-one match with the previous version. So it's like, it's easy to fix. It's almost like a SED, like search and replace type thing, rather than having to sort of re-architect the code locally. And for certain classes of issues, you can't do that, right? That like this isn't like, oh, always you can do this, and if you're not doing it, it's just because you're lazy. Like, there are some cases where it's just fundamentally very hard. Mm-hmm. But I think there are some cases where you can make localized changes and still get a lot of the value without necessarily having to understand like overall program flow and global state and some things like that. Yep. But yeah, it does require rigorous testing to ensure that you haven't broken anything, depending on if the code might rely on some of the side effects that could have security implications that you're sort of taking away by rolling out the secure wrapper library. Yeah. And some things I think are bigger changes than others. I feel like, for example, killing cross-site scripting by porting everything to React rather than sort of jQuery or whatever you're using now, like that's a massive engineering undertaking because you're rewriting basically everything. But some other things like parameterizing all SQL queries or using like an XML secure wrapper library. I feel like those, it depends on obviously your language and framework, but that seems to me like maybe more localized, at least on average. But yeah, I totally agree. It's a great approach, but it's can be hard in practice, like I guess everything.
If we can all start from scratch today, we would not have that problem. But unfortunately, we're always running on a ton of legacy code because what quite often happens is, it was not intended to be a big project, and you start working on something, and there always has to be a market fit first. And once there's a market fit, then you start to think about security, and you already produced a ton of legacy code.
Yeah, let's just prototype it, and then we'll rewrite it later, and then that prototype is prod forever.
Exactly. We see that all too often, right? And another thing that you're diving into in all the talks that you've seen in the last couple of years is scaling threat modeling, and you actually talk to a lot of like top-notch people in this field too that are doing threat modeling on a day-to-day basis or have built a career on threat modeling. So how do you, what have you learned, and like how can you scale threat modeling today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So just to take a step back, so threat modeling is like, how do we get an understanding of like the sort of big picture security risks to a system? Like, what are the threat actors? What sort of big picture things should we have to worry about? More at like sort of like the whiteboard diagram sort of things rather than like a specific code vulnerability. Just, I don't know if listeners maybe care about the context. But so it used to be in like a waterfall development method. You could sort of like, before the project we'll threat model, this is everything it's going to do. But now things are happening very quickly. Typically AppSec teams are small. They can't sit in every meeting. So it's like, how do you get reasonable threat modeling coverage given that you just can't possibly threat model every story or every epic even, because you have 500 developers and like 2 AppSec engineers.
Yep.
So I've seen a couple of main approaches. I would say having like security questionnaires, doing like integrating threat modeling into the SDLC, having developers do it. And then there's like this idea of threat model as code. And I'll talk about each one of these in a little more detail. Or good. You can just ask whichever one.
No, like the last one sounds very interesting. And threat modeling as code, would love to hear about that, but feel free to go through all 3.
Yeah, so just like super quickly, security questionnaires is basically like acknowledging that, as an AppSec team, we can't threat model everything. So how do we focus our time on the things that matter the most? So the idea is having like a mini web app or maybe even a Slack bot that says, hey, you're building a new thing, like answer this series of questions. And then depending on how high risk it looks, then the AppSec team will get involved. So they might say things like, are you building a new service versus extending an existing one? Are you touching PII? If so, like how sensitive? What language are you using? What framework are you using? Are you parsing XML? Are you talking to the PCI environment? Basically, like as a security engineer, like what would you ask a developer in terms of like how much do I care about this? Yeah. And then at the end of it, it computes some sort of like customized risk score, whether like low, medium, or high. And then the AppSec team then does a more detailed manual thing with projects or initiatives that are more high risk. So that's like security questionnaire.
Is there a good security questionnaire out there? Like, is there a default one that you can recommend?
There's not a default one, but there are several public ones. So I think Autodesk has a couple of their security questionnaire questions in like a GitHub repo. Mozilla has like a rapid risk assessment is what they call it, which is basically the same thing. Okay. And Slack gave a talk at AppSec USA a couple of years ago, and they released their tool, GoSDL, which is sort of how they do it. So there's at least 3, probably more, that can give you some example questions. Okay. But I think what most organizations do is they sort of figure out what makes sense for them, and then they sort of take bits and pieces from what's out there. It seems very customized. I don't see a centralized questionnaire, at least yet.
Yep. Okay.
But yeah, and then so integrating into SDLC, just having developers as they're discussing functional requirements say, hey, how could this feature be abused, and how can we prevent that? Something very simple, something that just adds maybe 2 minutes to every sprint planning meeting that at least gets them part of the way there, has them start thinking as an adversary.
Okay.
And then threat model as code, what you cared about the whole time.
I was waiting for that one.
Yeah, so this is actually, I would say there's like several ideas under this. So different people say threat model as code means different things, is one thing I found. So one is including like annotations in code based on your like assumptions of where attacker input could come in, or basically it's like you're encoding in the code itself your sort of threat model. I'll send you a link to it. I'm not as enthused about this idea because I feel like causing code changes is probably unlikely to be worth it at scale. Another approach is typically threat models are like drawn in like graphical programs, which are not great in that it's like hard to put those in source control, and it's not easy to see how they change over time. So I think Izar from Autodesk, they built like PyTM, I believe, where you can basically write a mini Python program that is sort of like, here are the grass and edges in our threat model. Like, here's the actors, here's the systems, and you can check this file into version control and see how it changes over time.
Interesting. Okay.
But the one that I think is most mapping to our mental model of what threat model as code should be is work by Abhay of We45, where basically he and his team have built a series of security automation frameworks where basically you write security integration tests that ideally you can reuse between services, where you say like, okay, because this application takes logins, I expect that it can start rate limiting if someone tries to brute force it or something like that. And you sort of codify this threat model expectation of how your system can behave using like Selenium or robot framework type tests, which you then run continuously in CI/CD.
Do you try to, so is that different? So you're trying to make that the same for all your applications? So how does that work in practice?
Yeah, I haven't played around with it in practice. It's more like I've watched a couple of talks he's given about it and just like chatted with people about it. But I think the idea is over time you're building up a library of, given what your application does, here are classes of threats that we want to handle. And then you sort of reuse which modules are applicable per application. So it's not necessarily like every app gets all the same tests, but you sort of have this library of like threats, and you then like test them on your various applications. But the idea is like, rather than having like a point in time threat model, you're sort of continuously testing it in code, not just like what we think it does.
It's definitely one of the harder problems. Like trying to threat modeling as such is already difficult. Trying to scale threat modeling is just an enormous project, and one where we may not have made enough progress in the last couple of years. And we're trying different things, and we're trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So it's good to see that there's a lot of ideas out there to see how we can scale threat modeling.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are working on it. It seems a common pain point from AppSec friends of mine. They're all like, I'm spending hours and hours threat modeling, and there's always more to do. It's a challenge many people are having. In
a previous company where I did a little bit of consulting, we tried out train the trainer with threat modeling. Trying to train developers on how to think about threat modeling, which then went to the team and tried to train their people on how to do threat modeling. That worked a little bit, if you make it simple and you try to standardize on certain things, but it is a very hard problem.
Yeah, I'm curious, did you have like a set series of questions you had people ask? Or I'm curious how you taught people to think about threat modeling.
Yeah, we mainly used Adam Shostak's book, essentially. We took a lot of ideas out of that book and worked with swim lane stuff and drawing stuff, and we tried to get something around that, trying to get some structure around that, how they could approach their projects, put that into a particular model and think about it. So that's how we did it. But it was a hard problem.
Nice.
Don't get me wrong. It was a very
Super
hard problem.
Yeah. Did you play at all with his card game? I think it's called Escalation of Privilege.
Yes, we did.
Nice.
Yeah, we did. Actually, did. We did. That was. I think we finished the training session off with playing that game. Maybe we didn't follow all the rules, but we found it very interesting, the questions that were on the card game.
Yeah. Did developers like it?
Did developers like it? We actually talked a lot to people. So we were talking to people that were already doing more AppSec than really developers, and then these people went to developers. So they liked it because there's a lot of things in there that you would not think of, you know. It's a good set of cards with a good set of questionnaires, and they vary a lot. So that's the good part.
Yeah, I think it's nice to have a sort of like a base framework of things that are just outside your like things you would just obviously think of to sort of spur you to be a bit more creative. Yeah, cool.
Maybe last question for you, Clint. So I watched what you've done in the last 2 years with looking into all these talks and trying to summarize them, and I was wondering like how many hours of sleep do you get, or is there some secret group of people in the back helping you out?
I wish there was a group of people helping me.
So there's no group? It's really you?
No, it's really just me.
Wow.
Yeah, I guess it's not that I do actually have some mild insomnia in terms of sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I can't go back to bed, so I'm like, oh, I might as well like do some stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, it's to be honest, it's just a fair amount of like nights and weekends, just like carving out little bits of time here and there.
Yeah. Well, I think you're extremely efficient with your time. So what you're doing and what you're producing, you must be extremely efficient with your time if you're able to do that.
I've gotten a lot better. Yeah. So I think the thing you're referring to is I gave a like a mega blog post where I summarized all 44 AppSec Cali 2019 talks,
yes,
which took me probably 200 to 400 hours, maybe more. But yeah, the first couple of summaries were very slow, but then by the end, I was a little bit more efficient. I haven't really told that many people this, but the last couple of weeks before I released that blog post, I was really cranking because I sort of delayed and I didn't space it out as I should have. Yeah. So I was doing like 1 to 3 summaries a day for like 2 or 3 weeks, and it was brutal.
That is brutal. That is. But, you know, the result is just fantastic, and I can highly recommend it for people, like actually people even new to the field or, you know, senior into the field. There's definitely there's stuff in there for every level of person in our field. So that's really good.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you can go check it out at tldrsec.com. Yeah, it's just freely out there, weekly newsletter.
Yep. Clint, thank you very, very much for accepting the invitation and being our 7th guru on the Software Security Gurus webcast. It was a fantastic chat. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, take care.
Thanks.